Thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate the attendance, especially early. Before we start and I introduce our guest, a few notices. If you're here and you're on the sixth form, you have extended lunch. All you have to do is go to your form tutor to tell them you've been to this particular talk and they'll sign you in. If you're in lower school, I'm afraid, unless you have permission from your form tutor, you'll have to go when the time is. Beside me, we're lucky to have George Galloway MP. Many of you will know him. If you don't, you should know. He's one of the most well-known and vocal political voices in modern times, at least in our lives. He's been involved with the Labour Party for many years and also more recently with the Respect Party, the party he leads, the party which he sits at in Parliament for in Bradford West, which he won a stunning by-election a few years ago. You'd think, having a Scottish and Irish background, he would be most vocal in British politics, which he is. But also he's a very prominent international voice, speaking issues to do with the Middle East, especially to do with the Iraq War. He's a very avid Palestinian campaigner, and also if you were to ask him questions relating to South America, or Russia, or Iran, or America, you would hear an answer of non-generic addition. And so the way the program's going to work is I'm going to pass over to Mr. Galloway, who will start by giving an opening, very short speech and introduction to himself, and then you can put your hand up and I'll try and see you and pick you, and you can ask your own questions about anything I've been told, anything to do with Mr. Galloway, to international politics, anything which interests you. So if you could please welcome Mr. George Galloway.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for that very kind introduction, and I'm very flattered to see so many of you missing your lunch for this talk. I'm not going to talk for long because there are many of you. Time is short, and I must rush at the end because I have to pick my own kid up from school at 3:15. So forgive me, I normally mingle at the end, pictures and so on, but I won't be able to do that today. Another time, I hope. We're different. I'm different. I regard the mainstream parties as three cheeks of the same backside that are indistinguishable in all material fact on all the most important issues. We say what we mean what we say. We're not in politics to fill our pockets with expenses, claims, asking the public to pay for our lunches and dinners, and so on. I'm virtually the lowest claiming MP in England. But that's not the most important difference. The most important difference is that on issues of war and peace, we're for peace. We're against empire. When I was your age, I came home and told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said that Britain had an empire then so vast that upon it the sun never set. And he, being Irish, answered, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. And I never had cause to doubt him. I hated empire then, I hate it now. I hate the history of the British Empire, and I'm certainly not going to remain quiet whilst new empires are planned and executed. We stand against austerity for the many, prosperity for the few. We believe in the redistribution of wealth and power in our society. Our teacher was the late and great Mr. Ben, who we buried last Thursday in St. Mary's Undercroft at Westminster, who was the best Prime Minister that Britain never had. I represent an exceedingly poor place, the city of Bradford and Bradford West within it, which is at the bottom of every league you'd want to be at the top of, and top of every league you'd want to be at the bottom of. It has the highest level of child mortality in the whole country. One child in every 100 dies before the age of 1. That's in Britain. In England, in 2014. We have the highest concentration of child poverty. We have the 10th worst schools in the country. I could go on, believe me. But it's important that you know it, because you have to gain a perspective on how life looks elsewhere. This is a very fine, grand school, a grammar school. I went to one very like it myself, and it's very easy when we live lives of relative prosperity to forget that the majority of places and people in the country are not living lives like ours. But we ignore that at our peril, because there can be no question of a small number of people going on living lives of prosperity and security and happiness, whilst all around them is a sea of misery, because eventually, in one way or another, that sea will lap at our feet, will cross any barrier that we seek to erect. The fact is that the gap between rich and poor in Britain today, 2014, is wider than it was when Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. That's official. That's a fact. And it's a fact that if we ignore and merely aspire to join that small coterie of people who live lives of plenty, we're unlikely, actually, by definition, all of us to succeed. But in any case, the wrath that is being nursed by the great majority of people in this country, of people who have little hope of material or social advance in their lives, that wrath will one day be terrible. So that's basically an outline of where we stand. We have a website, respectparty.org. You can follow me, as many people do, on Twitter at George Galloway, and on Facebook, George Galloway MP. We're constantly updating where we stand on the great issues of the day. I close with this. I prefer to be here today than in the House of Ill Repute that stands by the River Thames. I can do far more good for the things I believe in being here talking to you today than being with them. We live in a time, I was just looking at the board in your wonderful hall, looking at the lives that were lost when this school was bombed in the Second World War, our finest hour, when we were one united society, standing for something extremely noble, for a time alone. I was looking at that and looking around at the ambience of this school, representing the best of British values, and thinking to myself how much we have lost. Our society is no more united. It is utterly atomized and divided. Our great institutions bankrupted. Bankrupted in the political sense as well as in the economic sense. Our politicians, many of them, have gone to jail for expenses, fraud. Many more should have done. There are people still sitting on the front benches of both the major parties who actually ought to be in prison for the abuse of public funds for which they are guilty. Our police force, the Stephen Lawrence case and many, many other cases, has been shown to be riddled with corruption and institutionalized racism. Our banking system, none of them yet have gone to prison, but frankly most of them should be imprisoned. They practically destroyed our country out of their own greed, avarice, and even criminality. Our newspapers, our media is on trial, literally. I can't talk about the ongoing trial, but the inquiry of late into the British media showed just how rotten it is. All of our great institutions have been gravely diminished and degraded by the passage of the years, even in my own lifetime. And I just don't like to see that, because I know that this is what could be. This school is what could be. This is what Britain could be. And I want this for every child in our country. I hope I haven't gone on too long. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Galloway. I'll start with you. Are we witnessing the decline of what used used to be old Labour, the traditional and genuine Labour?
I really don't think so. One of the notes of disagreement that I struck in all the eulogies that I did around the death of Mr. Ben, who was my friend, my teacher for 40 years, was the idea that he was a nice, kindly old gentleman, but his views were somehow beyond the pale. In fact, if you analyze every one of his views on the major issues of then and now, going back 40 years, the great majority of British people agreed with him rather than the prevailing orthodoxy. Dr. Johnson said that the grimmest of dictatorships is the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy. I hope that you spend the rest of your lives questioning, challenging orthodoxy. But on the great issues of the war in Iraq, for example, Mr. Ben was right on the need for public ownership of the great public services that were privatized in the Thatcher-Blair era. The vast majority of people are with him. The vast majority of people cannot understand why people struggle to pay their gas and electricity bills so that those big companies can make £1.3 billion in profit when once all of that energy belonged to us, all of us. It was the public that invested in it, public that laid down the wires, the pipes, all the transmission through which this energy passes, on the undemocratic character of the European Union. Mr. Ben was right. He was right on the great swathe of events. So I don't believe he was the last of the Mohicans. The Mohicans are coming back because most people actually agree with what the so-called Mohicans are saying.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. Could you just raise it? What is What is a Mohican?
A Mohican. I'm showing my age. Mohicans were a tribe of Native Americans who were wiped out in the genocide that took place in North America when the white settlers arrived. And there was a very famous movie, sadly too long ago now, with Daniel Day-Lewis, when he was literally the last of the Mohicans. And I think he died in the film, so the Mohicans were no more. But it's not true, because the great issues that face us, the crisis in which we sit here today, can only be resolved by our ideas. Mr. Ben used to quote a German socialist called Rosa Luxemburg. She said at the beginning of the 20th century that the future would be either socialism or barbarism. And I believe that that dichotomy remains today. If we don't move in the direction of our ideas, we will endlessly be at war. We will endlessly be atomized as a society, divided between rich and poor, and there will endlessly be a crisis in our political and social life.
What's your view of Western interference in the Middle East, past and present?
Well, it's been disastrous. I thought you were going to ask me about Western civilization, which would have given me the opportunity to reprise Mr. Gandhi, the great leader of Indian independence, who, when asked what he thought about Western civilization, he answered, yes, that would be a good idea. And it would indeed be a good idea. Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair are, of course, the biggest footprints in this mess, and it has been a catastrophic blunder. You cannot find anyone, anywhere, least of all in Parliament, which voted for it, who any longer will say that invading and occupying Iraq in 2003 was a good idea. In fact, some of them say if they'd known then what they know now, they would have done differently. But they have no excuse for having not known then, because millions of us were on the streets telling them exactly that it would be a catastrophic idea. Mr. Blair now pretends that he didn't know that Iraq would develop in the way that it has. But he did know, because I told him, man to man, outside the gentleman's lavatory in the library corridor, to be precise. I told him this: there is no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but if you and Bush invade it, there will be hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda. And not just in Iraq, it will cascade around the world, including here in our own country. Secondly, that the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning. And the Iraqis will fight you with their teeth, if necessary, until they have driven you from their land. I told them that the making war endlessly against Muslims abroad could only create a state of war in our own country between Muslims and others. And I told him many other things. Luckily for him, Alistair Campbell, his liar-in-chief, pulled him away before it got too frisky. So the war, the invasion of Iraq, was a calamitous blunder, easily the greatest blunder that British foreign policy has ever made, certainly since the First World War. And of course, the colonization of Palestine has placed a cancer at the heart of the entire Arab world, which has infected everything and everybody for almost a century. In the building in which I have sat for 27 years now, I pass every day the room in which the British Foreign Secretary authored that whole disaster, when on behalf of one people he promised to a second people the land that belonged to a third people, making it unique even by imperialist standards, was that Britain did not even possess Palestine when it gave it away. Now, imperialism is a big word. I could refer you to many big books about it. But George Orwell, in his first novel, Burmese Days, drawing on his own experience as a colonial official through the mouth of the hero of the book, Jim Florey, says this. A young woman asks him, "What's imperialism?" He says, "It's going to other people's countries, killing them and stealing their things." That's what I mean about empire. And there are many faces I can see here whose parents or grandparents undoubtedly came from that empire. If not ours, then one of the other European settler empires. There are some kids from Bengal here, I'm sure. When Britain arrived in Bengal, it was the richest place in the whole world. And when Britain left Bengal, it was the poorest place in the whole world. And you don't have to be Einstein to work out what happened in between. The British Empire stole everything that it could carry. In the case of Africans, even the people themselves, in chains, in the holds of ships, sailed across the 7 seas, dying in their hundreds of thousands, to be deposited in the Caribbean and in North America to work the rest of their lives as slaves, as owned beasts of burden. So the next time you're nervous about a black fellow walking behind you, just remember he's got a lot more reason, if you're white, to be nervous about you than you do about him.
I want to ask you about a similar question about military intervention in Crimea by Russia. I wanted to ask you if you believe that intervention was justified or whether it was not.
Well, I wouldn't describe it as military intervention. Russia had, by treaty, the right to maintain 30,000 soldiers in Crimea. And in fact, had and has only half of that number. So if somebody has a treaty that says they can have 30,000 soldiers in a territory, but they only have half of that, I think it's stretching a point to describe it as military intervention. But Ukraine had a government, it had a constitution, it had a president, however bad they were, however bad it
It was a
was,
revolution.
I didn't support it, which burned down the presidency, drove the president from the country, threatened to kill the members of parliament unless they voted in a certain way, and tore up the constitution. And in fact, the very first act of the new revolutionary government in Kiev was to abolish Russian as a language. Well, I'm sorry, Russia's too big to be abolished. And any Russian living in the borders of Ukraine, certainly in the autonomous Republic of Crimea, I stress that, Crimea was the autonomous Republic of Crimea within the Ukrainian state. It had a right at any time to leave Ukraine, and it has decided democratically to do so in overwhelming numbers. And I'm afraid that that's a horse that's now already bolted.
On that, so while you're on the topic, would you question the nature of the election in Crimea, the conditions in which it was, and also perhaps the influence which the Russians had on the verdict?
No, I really don't know of any authority, right-wing or left-wing, pro-Russian or anti-Russian, who has contested the fact that the vast majority of people in Crimea wanted to leave Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. I defy you to Google and find a credible academic or other observer who otherwise believes, other than that the Crimean people have expressed their democratic wishes, as is their right to do, as is Scotland about to do in September, and that's not going very well, I must tell you, as someone who wants to keep the country together. But we in England don't have a vote on whether Scotland leaves us, and I'm Scottish, and I don't have a vote. So why would Ukrainians have a vote on whether Crimea, an autonomous republic, left them?
I think it's fair to say you've drawn a great deal of support away from Labour, the only realistic centre-left party. As well as this, the Respect Party is quite orientated around you, I think it's fair to say, and many of its voters vote for your personality as opposed to the far-left values of your party, I feel. Is it fair to say that you've drawn support away from mainstream centre-left politics in Britain, which has in some ways contributed to the Labour defeat in 2010 and by extension paved the way for austerity?
Wow. Well, the people in Bradford West didn't think so, because they elected me in a landslide victory just exactly 2 years ago last Saturday with 58% of the vote in an 8-party race, utterly humiliating the so-called centre-left Labour Party, of which you're clearly a partisan. And the reason is, of course, people hear the leaders first. Mr. Benn was a great leader, and people heard him. But behind him was a great movement. And once upon a time, people like you would have been a part of it. You wouldn't have described Mr. Benn's politics as far left, but his politics and my politics are absolutely identical. That I can assure you. So don't throw these health warning words around like far left. I'm not far left. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a communist. I'm not a Leninist. I'm not a Trotskyist. I'm a Labourist. And it's the fact that Labour kicked me out. Mr. Blair kicked me out as part of the transformation of Labour, from Labour to New Labour to non-Labour to anti-Labour, which it currently is today. You see, what we have today, led by Mr. Miliband, is not centre-left, and it doesn't even pretend to be. The Douglas Alexander, the Labour Party leading figure who's in charge of their general election campaign, said 2 days ago, in writing, in The Guardian, that Labour intends to dominate the centre ground of British politics. But of course, if there's no left, then the centre is the right. Think. Do the percentages. If nobody is arguing for left politics, then the centre ground inevitably must be between the centre and the right. And that's not a real centre, as the election result in Bradford proved. It's not the case that there's only an inch in that prevailing orthodoxy, that we can be a country of neoliberal economics, imperialist foreign policy, and endless war. I reject that prevailing orthodoxy, and so do most people in Britain. So you should take back to your Labour friends. The reality is that there is a market for, a political market for real Labour politics. And that's all I am projecting. Well, you've obviously not watched my speech at the Oxford Union on this very point. Because if you had, trust me, you would not have asked that question. Have a look at my answer to a young man who looked very like you, who asked an equally foolish question. Venezuela is one of the great hopes of the world. Hugo Chavez is one of the greatest men of this or any other century. That is a view shared by hundreds of millions of people around the world, but most importantly, it's a view shared by the majority of Venezuelans. It's true that the richer the Venezuelan, the less likely they are to love Chavez, and the poorer the Venezuelan, the more likely they are to love Chavez. But what does that tell you? That tells you that the transformation of Venezuela through the Bolivarian Revolution has utterly turned the tables upside down in Venezuela. And where once the country's oil wealth was the plaything of a tiny section of the oligarchy in the country, has now been redistributed. I could speak for the rest of the day on this. Chavez has built more schools, more universities, more houses for the public, sent 2 satellites into space. Where once 80% of Venezuelans were malnourished, now 90% of them have got to watch their weight. The blackest people, the mixed people, the disabled people, and before you say it, the gay people, the people who were oppressed under the oligarchy and the oligarchic governments that came before Chavez, are all out for Chavez. I've been there. My wife and I were at the last Chavez victory. Millions upon millions of people coming down from the slums in an endless stream to support Chavez's victory. I always think it's useful to look at who a person's enemies are when you judge them as to their character and their purpose. Take a look at the enemies of Chavez and the Venezuelan Revolution. Take a look at who they are. Take a look at what they are. And I'll tell you what side you should be on.
Mr. Galloway, for what I think is an endorsement of our society similar to Oxford Union, so thanks a lot. What was the question?
I just wanted to know, Mr. Galloway, will you be standing in the London mayoral election, and what do you think gives you the credibility to be able to represent such a vast city?
Well, I'll only represent it if people vote for me, and they'll only get a chance to vote for me if I decide to stand, and I haven't made up my mind about that yet. Boris Johnson has been a disastrous mayor for London. That's what happens when you elect a clown. It's really not funny. It's really not funny. Johnson has been a disaster. He is an educated oaf, the wisest fool in Christendom. He's a Bullingdon boy from Eton and Oxford, and he has nothing in common with the vast majority of Londoners.
He's not standing.
in Westminster. I hope he does. That'll doom the Tories to eternal defeat. Mr. Livingston, who was a very good friend of mine, is a very good friend of mine, is not standing again for Labour. He's retired, but New Labour wouldn't choose him anyway. They're choosing instead, it would appear, Dame, I'm not calling her a dame, she calls herself a dame. The Queen bestowed the title, Dame Tessa Jow. So, if the Tory candidate is not Boris Johnson, as it seems likely, and the Labour candidate is not Ken Livingstone, I think I might have a good chance. Because I think the majority of people in London, and bear a number of things in mind. Contrary to the propaganda of the Scottish nationalists, the streets of London are not paved with gold. In fact, there's more poverty in 7-mile radius of Westminster than there is in the whole of Scotland or any other region of the United Kingdom. The vast majority of people in London are working people, who include the working poor, who are poor even though they're working, the unemployed, the young people, the students that the Liberal Democrats betrayed and who have to pay their... You've got a Liberal Democrat MP, I understand, and I understand he was here recently. I hope you asked him why he lied in order to get into Parliament, saying he'd abolish tuition fees only to triple them.
He said he lied on one account and not the other. That was the justification.
Sorry?
They made two promises. One they let down, but he trumped. The other they didn't let down.
Oh really? What was the one they didn't let down?
I think not reducing it further or something like this.
Well, I saw them sign virtually in their blood a pledge that they would abolish tuition fees. Instead, they tripled them to £9,000 a year for every one of you to go to university. Now, I never went to university. I left school at 16. I've been paying tax ever since so that these politicians could go to university and get a student grant to enjoy it with, absolutely free. And they have kicked that ladder away from you. How did I get onto this? I was talking about London. The majority of people in London are in fact from the minorities. The last census shows that 53% of people in the minority ethnic communities in London are the majority. And I'm quite popular, by the grace of God, amongst minorities. Because I stand up for them, I defend them, I analyse the world in a way which they can recognize. Don't need to believe me, ask some of the visible minorities who are here. So I think I'd have a good chance. So I might do it. It would be a big challenge, but I like challenges.
We're in a society where inevitably, because of first past the post, a lot of people say, like Chris, are going to vote for Labour because it's the only big left-wing party. And I'm not saying that's right, but how, as a very small, actually left-wing party, do you kind of plan to have a real impact when realistically there's only two big parties at the moment?
Yeah, there is only two big parties because the Liberal Democrats will be completely annihilated at the election. They'll be very rare indeed. But you're wrong when you describe Labour as a left-wing party. For the reasons I gave earlier, it is not. It is Tweedledee or Tweedledum that will govern the country at the next election. But you don't have to worry about that dilemma because we're small, we cannot stand in most constituencies. In those constituencies where we're not standing, we ask people to vote Labour because they're better than the Tories. Only just, but they're better than the Tories. But where we have a chance, and obviously in Bradford we had one hell of a chance, but nobody noticed. I'm not a betting man, I don't believe in gambling, but if I had been, on the day I arrived in Bradford, which was only 19 days before the vote, it was 300 to 1 against me winning. If I'd put £1,000 on, I'd have been £300,000 richer. But I didn't, though I know some people who did. And I'm happy for them. where we have a chance, we do stand. And in the London mayoralty, which is a transferable vote system, so you vote 1, 2, 3. If I stood, my task would be to come ahead of Dame Tessa Jowell, who once said that she'd throw herself in front of a bus for Tony Blair. That's a quote she'll be hearing more of over the next couple of years. And there's plenty of buses in London if you do so, thanks to Ken. Now, in that election, we have a real chance, and that's where people would be able to make a real choice.
Just at this point, if you're in year 7 to year 11, you may have to go and register. So I think that is the case, unless you're allowed to stay. So if you are, if you could all leave now, that would be. Unless you want to break the rules and stay, in which case, by all means. Greg.
Why did you choose to play on Big Brother in 2006? And do you not think that it would harm your image as a politician?
Well, the main reason I did it was to raise a very large sum of money for Palestinian refugees in Gaza. We didn't have many other people raising very large sums of money for them. And I think that there's a long tradition of people in public life making themselves silly to raise money. It happens every year, Red Nose Day and all of that. So that was the first of my goals, and that was achieved. From my own payment, I employed 3 workers in my constituency office, then in Bethnal Green and Bow, so becoming the biggest constituency MP's office in the whole country. And that was good, I think, for the people in my borough. But I also wanted to reach an audience that no other politician has ever reached. And I think that in time that will prove useful. Because a very large number of young people know me if I paraded the 650 British MPs past you now, I promise you would know hardly any of them. So I don't regret doing it, but I wouldn't do it again.
Do you think that we can find a realistic democratic resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I think the only solution to the conflict is to have one democratic state called Israel-Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, with a hyphen, and in whichever order you please. Because this small territory is too small to meaningfully be divided into 2 states. In any case, Netanyahu and the one before him and the one after him have no intention whatsoever of allowing a viable, meaningful Palestinian state to emerge. And if it did, it would be divided between the West Bank and Gaza, separated by Israel. The apartheid wall disfigures the territory. The Israeli settlements, illegal settlements in Jerusalem and elsewhere on the West Bank, have paved over much of the land that was originally talked about 20 years ago at the Oslo Agreement as the method by which the people could be separated and a 2-state solution could emerge. So I believe, and I fight for, and I was speaking in Tunisia yesterday, the day before yesterday, and Morocco the night before that, on the Palestinian Land Day events, and that's the campaign that I fight for one democratic and secular state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, where Jews and Muslims and Christians live as equal citizens under the law. It was good enough for post-apartheid South Africa, it's good enough for post-apartheid Israel.
Hi, you talk about the uneven distribution of wealth within Britain. So what economic policies would you implement to destroy the travesty that is the poor-rich divide?
Well, let me quote to you, not a dangerous revolutionary or a far leftist, but Mr. Dr. Vince Cable, who currently sits in the British Cabinet. He said before the last election that if we collected all the taxes that the richest people and corporations in this country avoid or evade, we would have no deficit. Get that, Sir Philip. This is theft from the public purse. And that £500 million that he should have paid, could have paid for all sorts of vitally necessary things in our country. And I could go on, Amazon, Starbucks, you know them all. They're all avoiding tax. We need to have a regime where if you make money in Britain, we demand our taxation share of that money that you made in Britain. Whatever clever accounting tricks you think you have pulled. And there are many other things that we could do. We could, for example, scrap the Trident nuclear weapons system, which we're about to renew at a cost of another 80 billion. 80 billion being the magic number, because that's the number of the deficit. We could wipe out the deficit with the tax. We could wipe it out again by scrapping nuclear weapons, which we cannot use except as an act of national suicide, because if we used them, whoever we were using them against would fire their nuclear weapons at us, and none of us would be here. So we can't use them. They are a grotesque waste of money. Even from a military point of view, even many generals and field marshals and many other officers have said that actually there are things that the military needs that are much cheaper and much more efficacious than Trident nuclear submarines. And we could bring back into public ownership that which was in public ownership. One of the problems speaking to a young audience is they were not here when it was otherwise. But your teachers know that once upon a time, British Gas was owned by us. The electricity companies were owned by us. The railway companies were owned by us. Now we merely subsidize private companies, most of them foreign, for running a substandard service, ever more expensive, ever more profitable for them. So let's keep that profit here.
Sorry for the apologies before.
Yeah. You said you didn't go to university. I was wondering how you got into politics, and also how you how you kind of hope to inspire young people at the moment who are obviously very apathetic towards politics into that career.
I don't think young people are apathetic. I think they're apoplectic about the pathetic nature of the political class. And the fact that this big crowd came here today, and trust me, every school I go to, from the most expensive public schools in the land. I spoke at Harrow a few months ago. People were sitting on the windowsills, standing in cupboards, sitting on the floor. There were hundreds there. And it's £32,000 a year to go to Harrow. And young people are interested in these great political issues. And so they should be, because they have more of a stake in our future than someone of my age does. I was born into politics, into a political household of Irish immigrants, Roman Catholic Irish immigrants. So it was my daily breakfast, lunch and dinner politics. And I never intended to have anything other than a political life. But let me make this clear, and your teachers will be glad that I do. Because I didn't go to university, please don't any of you get the idea that you shouldn't go either. And if any of my own children say that they're not going to university, I'll put their arms up their back and march them there. Because I've been very lucky that not having gone to university, I nonetheless acquired the knowledge that I have and the position that I have and so on. But in today's world, it's vital, if you possibly can, that you go to university and study hard and get the best degree that you can.
The last question, and just the last two, depending on the question and the answer. So, Jamal.
How do you believe there is a way of resolving the Syria conflict currently?
Syria? Well, the same way that Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, as was, outlined almost 3 years ago. And if we'd followed his policy, then the solution may already have been with us. But we ignored Kofi Annan, having appointed him to do that job. We ignored his proposals for a transition to democratic rule in Syria. Instead, we followed a policy of flooding Syria with the most extreme jihadists, more than 100,000 of them. The very Al-Qaeda types that I told Mr. Blair would proliferate if he and Bush invaded and occupied Iraq. We have flooded them now into Syria. And the results are plain for all to see, though I don't recommend that you go to YouTube to see them. Thousands of people having their heads chopped off, even their hearts cut out and eaten, Christian churches destroyed, nuns, even bishops murdered, and priests killed by the dozen, minority religions persecuted, terrified, hunted down. And as I asked Mr. Cameron at Prime Minister's Questions about 6 months ago, at the time we were sending our Air Force to help France to fight Al-Qaeda in Mali, I asked him if he would explain to the House the main differences, just the main ones, between the Al-Qaeda we were fighting in Mali and the Al-Qaeda we were paying for and arming in Syria. Of course, answer had he none, because how could you answer that? I asked him in that question if he'd read the novel Frankenstein, and if so, did he read it to the end? Because if he read it to the end, he would know that Dr. Frankenstein's creation very quickly broke free of its creator and had a law, was a law unto itself. And that's what happens with monsters. That's why they're called monsters. And I've lived why they're called monsters. And I've lived long enough to know that we've done this, been there before. In Afghanistan, I was the last man standing in the British Parliament. I told Mrs. Thatcher when she was at the dispatch box. I was never at the dispatch box. But she was. I told her on the eve of the fall of Kabul to the fathers of the Taliban, the fathers of Al-Qaeda, although some of the Al-Qaeda people are one and the same, I told her that you have opened the gates for the barbarians, and a long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan, because of course Britain and America paid for and armed and supported in every way the people they now ask you to denounce and send your soldiers to go and fight in Afghanistan. They're only there because we sent them there. The Afghans have been punished twice. They were punished by sending them bin Laden, and then punished because they had bin Laden. How's that for morality? So that's what we have followed in Syria. It's a policy close to madness. I said to William Hague just recently in the lift, you've been wrong all your life, but I never believed you to be insane. But what you're doing in Syria is literally insane. You're now telling us that the biggest security threat in Britain is returning jihadists coming from Syria, whilst you're the person and the government that encouraged this jihad in the first place. So, dig out Kofi Annan's plan, implement it, and let's have a proper future, multi-faith, a multi-racial future for Syria. I think that's probably
Before we say goodbye to Mr. Galloway, we do this tradition with every MP who comes in. We have 1 minute to pitch to, especially young people. When we can vote, if respect is on the ballot box, if it's there, why should we vote for them?
Well, if you're Scottish, you'll have a vote already, because they gave 16-year-olds the right to vote in the Scottish independence referendum. They thought it was a very clever wheeze, but actually it's backfired spectacularly. The biggest group of no voters in Scotland is the 16 to 24-year-old group. It just goes to show that most knowledge does repose amongst the youngest people. So if you've got an address in Scotland, vote no on separation, because separating this small country into two countries is a very, very bad idea. But if you're 18 already, then you should vote Labour in the constituencies where we are not standing, and that's the vast majority of constituencies. And if you're 18 by the time the London election comes, who knows who you'll be able to vote for. Thank you very much.
Mr. Galloway, thanks all of you for attending, and keep your ears up for other events we've got going on in the next few weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.